I stood at attention in my dress blues, diploma in hand, cameras flashing around me. 2 seats in the front row had been reserved for my parents. They stayed empty. That evening, still wearing my uniform, I opened social media and saw my sister Emily's latest post. Balloons. A cake with white frosting. My parents smiling while my mother held our family dog like a baby. The caption read, "Best birthday ever." The timestamp matched the exact moment I had graduated. I stared at the photo for nearly 10 minutes before accepting a painful truth. My parents had chosen the dog's birthday over one of the biggest days of my life. My name is Zoe Campbell. I'm a major in the United States Army, and for most of my life I believed that if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, and became successful enough, my parents would finally love me the way they loved my younger sister. It took me 36 years to realize that kind of love was never mine to earn. I grew up in a wealthy family where appearances meant everything. My father, Richard Campbell, had built a successful real estate empire, and my mother, Linda, cared more about how our family looked than how it felt. Emily was always the center of attention. I was simply expected to succeed quietly. When I was 12, I won the highest academic award in my school. I rushed home, convinced my parents would finally be proud. My father glanced at the certificate, nodded once, then returned to reading his newspaper. 2 weeks later, Emily received nothing more than a participation ribbon at a spelling bee. My mother threw her a celebration with balloons and cake. Standing in the corner of the dining room, I couldn't understand what I had done wrong. Nothing changed as we grew older. I worked harder. I earned better grades. I was accepted into a respected university before choosing to become an army officer. Instead of saying he was proud, my father simply said, "That's an unusual career choice. I hope you know what you're doing." Emily struggled to keep even part-time jobs, yet my parents called her a free spirit who simply needed time. Then I met Daniel Brooks. He wasn't wealthy or connected. He was a high school history teacher, the son of an electrician, and one of the kindest people I'd ever met. He listened when I spoke. He remembered small details. He made me feel valued without asking me to earn it. My parents disliked him immediately. When I told my father we were getting married, he looked me in the eye and said, "Our family doesn't marry people like him." I told him I loved Daniel and would marry him anyway. Without hesitation, he replied, "Then you're on your own." He returned to his paperwork exactly the way he'd returned to his newspaper years earlier. My parents attended the wedding only because appearances mattered. Afterward, my father repeatedly reminded me, "You married beneath yourself." For years, I tried to ignore those words. Daniel and I built a quiet, happy life together while I continued serving in the Army. Eventually, I completed one of the military's toughest officer training programs. It demanded everything I had. When graduation finally arrived, I wanted only one thing: for my parents to see me succeed. They promised they'd be there. Throughout the ceremony, I kept looking toward those 2 empty seats, convincing myself they were simply late. They weren't. They had chosen a dog's birthday party instead. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I blocked every phone number, every email, every social media account. No calls, no messages, no holidays, no birthdays. 5 years of complete silence. Then one afternoon my phone rang. The caller ID read, "Arthur Benson, my father's attorney." I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Arthur spoke carefully. "Your father needs one signature regarding your grandfather's trust." "Tell him he lost the right to ask me for anything 5 years ago," I replied. Arthur paused before quietly asking if he could explain in person. Against my better judgment, I agreed. A few days later, he arrived at our modest home. Daniel was outside repairing our old wooden fence. As I watched them shake hands, I noticed Arthur studying Daniel with quiet surprise, as though he'd expected someone completely different. Inside, We sat around the kitchen table Daniel had built with his own hands. Arthur looked around our simple home. "You have a nice life here," he finally said. "We do," I answered. "It's ours." He opened his briefcase and slid a thick folder across the table. "Your father needs your signature," he explained. "It's only paperwork involving your grandfather's estate." I opened the documents. Years in the army had taught me one lesson above all others. Small details save lives, so I read every page carefully. The language was confusing. Long legal paragraphs, complicated wording, hidden clauses. The more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. One section appeared to change how my grandfather's trust would eventually be divided, but it never clearly explained exactly what I would be giving up. I looked at Arthur. If my grandfather created this trust, why does my father need my permission to change it? Arthur hesitated. "It's complicated." That hesitation told me everything. I slowly closed the folder. "I'm not signing anything today." Arthur looked genuinely surprised. "Your father hoped this could be handled quickly." "Then he'll have to wait," I replied. "My attorney will review every word before I sign anything." For the first time, I realized something had changed. 5 years earlier, I probably would have trusted my father. Now, I trusted my instincts instead. Within a week, I hired Patricia Alvarez, an experienced estate attorney. I handed her the documents Arthur had brought and explained everything: the pressure to sign, the confusing language, and my father's sudden urgency. 4 days later, Patricia called. Her voice was serious. "Zoe, you need to sit down." She explained that my grandfather had created the trust nearly 30 years earlier. It wasn't my father's money. The trust belonged equally to me and Emily. My father had only been appointed trustee, meaning he could manage the assets, but he did not own them and could not legally change how they were divided. "So, what was I being asked to sign?" I asked. "A voluntary waiver," Patricia answered. "If you signed it, you would give up most of your inheritance, allowing Emily to receive almost everything." For a moment, I sat in complete silence. Then every memory came rushing back. The forgotten award, the birthday parties, the empty graduation seats, the dog's birthday. This wasn't a new betrayal. It was simply the biggest one. Patricia explained that my father couldn't change the trust unless I willingly signed away my rights. That was why he wanted everything done quickly before I had time to understand what the documents actually meant. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I smiled for the first time in years. "Let's see how desperate they become." Patricia understood immediately. We signed nothing. We simply waited. 3 days later, my father began calling. Again and again. I ignored every call. Soon the text messages arrived. "Call me. This is important. We need to discuss the paperwork." I never answered. Then my mother called. Then Emily. 5 years of silence suddenly didn't matter anymore because they needed something from me. Emily eventually texted, "This affects the whole family." I still didn't respond. Eventually, my father arranged a meeting through Arthur. We met at an expensive restaurant, exactly the kind of place where my father always felt powerful. He greeted me with a smile as though nothing had happened. "You look well," he said. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of the past. Just another performance. At first, he spoke about family, about forgiveness, about moving on. He carefully avoided mentioning my graduation, or the dog's birthday, or 5 years of silence. When I remained quiet, his tone changed. "Emily needs this trust more than you do. She hasn't had your opportunities. You already have your career, your husband, your simple little life." There it was. The same insult he'd repeated for years. The same belief that everything I had somehow made me less deserving of what was already mine. I calmly placed Patricia's research on the table. The original trust documents, highlighted clauses, every page my father had hoped I'd never read. His expression changed immediately. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "I read everything," I replied, "including the parts you hoped I'd miss." For the first time in my life, my father had no response. I stood up. "No." Just one word. Then I walked away. 2 weeks later, legal papers began arriving. My father had filed motions against me, hoping the cost and stress of a lawsuit would force me to surrender. "His arguments won't survive in court," she assured me. "He's trying to pressure you into giving up." He didn't understand something. The army had taught me how to stay calm under pressure. Waiting didn't scare me. Emily chose another strategy. She began posting online. At first, the posts were vague. "Some people only care about money." Then she mentioned me by name. She accused me of destroying the family and stealing what our grandfather supposedly wanted her to have. Old classmates suddenly started messaging me. People who hadn't spoken to me in years wanted my side of the story. I ignored every one of them. Instead of arguing online, Patricia kept collecting evidence. During discovery, she uncovered something unexpected. For years, my father had been paying himself trustee management fees that appeared to exceed what the trust legally allowed. That discovery changed everything. A few days later, Arthur called me. This time, he sounded exhausted. "I need to ask you something honestly," he said. "Did you already know about those excessive trustee fees?" "No," I answered. "My attorney found them." Arthur became quiet. Finally, he admitted, "Your father wasn't honest with me either." He explained that after Patricia began asking questions, my father had instructed him to rewrite the documents so the redistribution clause would be even harder to detect. That was the moment Arthur realized he had been helping deceive my father's own daughter. "I trusted him for over 20 years," Arthur admitted. "I don't think I can anymore." For the first time, even my father's own attorney had begun questioning him. The case was no longer going the way Richard Campbell had planned. The final negotiation meeting was held at Arthur's law firm. My father chose the location carefully. He wanted home field advantage. The polished conference room, the city skyline, the expensive suits, it was the same image of power he'd relied on his entire life. Emily sat beside him with her arms crossed. Patricia sat quietly beside me. Arthur looked different than before. The confidence he'd always carried around my father was gone. My father smiled and slid one final document across the table. "I think this version is fair to everyone." I began reading. The wording was smoother than before, but the goal hadn't changed. He still wanted to shift most of the trust to Emily. Then I noticed something. Buried deep in one paragraph was a new clause. I read it again. Then, a third time. Suddenly, I laughed. A real laugh. Everyone looked at me in confusion. Arthur leaned forward. "What's so funny?" I turned the document toward him. "Did my father write this clause himself?" Arthur read it carefully. His expression changed instantly. The clause my father had personally added gave himself permanent authority over the trust. But he had forgotten one critical detail. My grandfather's original trust clearly stated that any attempt by a trustee to expand his own authority would immediately remove him as trustee and trigger full distribution of the trust under the original equal terms. My father's own greed had activated the very clause that destroyed his entire plan. Instead of gaining control, he lost all control. Arthur slowly lowered the document. "He's removed himself as trustee," he said quietly. My father grabbed the papers. His hands were shaking. "That's impossible. This has to be a drafting mistake." Arthur shook his head. "No, I warned you not to change this language yourself." Emily looked completely confused. She finally realized the entire plan had collapsed. For the first time in my life, My father had absolutely nothing to say. 6 weeks later, the judge issued the final ruling. The court enforced my grandfather's original trust exactly as written. Equal division, no changes, no special treatment, no trustee control. My father lost everything he had been fighting for. Oddly enough, I didn't feel victorious. I only felt peaceful. The fight was finally over. About a month later, Emily called. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. She admitted she'd spent her entire life depending on others and no longer knew who she was without that safety net. She didn't fully apologize, but it was the closest she'd ever come. I listened. I didn't forgive her. But I didn't hang up either. Some relationships don't need to be rebuilt immediately. Sometimes they simply need time. My father also asked to meet. Twice. Both times I declined. Not because I hated him, but because I had finally learned something that took me 36 years to understand. Closure doesn't always come from one last conversation. Sometimes closure is simply deciding you no longer need one. When my share of the trust was finally distributed, I used it to build something meaningful. I created scholarships for children of active duty service members. I donated to organizations supporting military families who had lost loved ones. And because Daniel had spent years changing young lives as a teacher while earning far less than he deserved, I donated to teacher training programs. None of it was done to prove anything to my father. That version of me had disappeared the night he skipped my graduation for a dog's birthday party. Instead, I invested in the life Daniel and I had already built. A quiet life. An honest life. One built with respect instead of approval. Sometimes I still remember standing in my dress blues, searching the audience for two parents who never came. For years that memory hurt. Now, it simply reminds me how far I've come. One evening, after all the paperwork was finished, Daniel and I stood in our backyard with cups of coffee. The fence he'd repaired years earlier still stood strong behind us. "You okay?" he asked. I looked around our small home, our peaceful life, the family we had chosen to build. Then I smiled. "I'm good." And for the first time, I truly meant it. The funniest part of this entire story isn't that my father lost the case. It's that he spent 5 years believing I still wanted his approval. The truth is, the moment he chose a dog's birthday over his own daughter's graduation, that door had already closed. Everything that happened afterward was simply him discovering it one legal document at a time.